physics student, and in this video I will explain how a 5-year experiment I conducted led me to the conviction that there is a God, and that it's a Christian God specifically. First, I will describe what the experiment was, then I will not just claim that it worked, but show you, and at the end of the video I will explain how you can try this at home. 5 years ago, I had the idea to test something. If Christianity is true, then it must work. Which means that the claims and promises that are in the Bible must be verifiable. We can't go back in time to see whether Jesus actually rose from the dead, but what we can do is do what Jesus told us to do and see if what he said would happen actually happens. If that man was truly God, then what he promised 2,000 years ago must still work today. When I started this experiment, I was at a point where I wanted to reject the faith that I grew up with. After all, I couldn't see God, and whether he existed or not didn't seem to have an impact on my life. And let's be real, Christianity makes some ridiculous claims. But certain events in my life prompted me to really investigate Christianity. I wondered what would happen if I just did what the saints advise people to do and what priests preach in their homilies, no matter the cost. Again, I wasn't convinced that God exists, and as a scientifically inclined person, I'm someone who is quite skeptical. But I thought to myself that if my experiment works, something along the way will happen that convinces me that there is a God. I mean, some saints are said to have levitated, so I thought to myself, if I try to become a saint and start levitating or something, that will kind of be enough to answer my question of God's existence. I also looked at the lives of people who took Catholicism to the extreme, the saints, and figured that I liked where they ended up. I must add that I wouldn't have tried this experiment with a religion that, if taken to the extreme, could be harmful to others. But Christianity is about radical love, so others could only profit from me trying this. I was also heavily inspired by the story of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who to this day is my favorite saint. St. Ignatius read the stories of the saints, and one day he just decided to become like them. And it worked. I wanted to see what would happen if an insignificant girl from Austria would do the same. So in February 2021, I decided to try this, and what I didn't notice at that time was that this was exactly 500 years after St. Ignatius of Loyola started his journey in 1521. So I started reading a theological book a week and tried to follow the advice of the saints to the best of my ability, no matter how hard it was. And while doing this, I observed whether what they promised actually happened. Before my Protestant viewers get nervous about what I was doing exactly, I would like to clarify. The advice of the saints mainly regarded prayer, actually. So I learned when to pray, how to pray, and what to pray for. The Bible says, ask and you will receive, so that's one example of a promise in the Bible. But you've probably noticed that, for example, if you pray for money to fall from the sky, that usually doesn't work. So either the saints were really stupid to still believe in God, even though prayer obviously didn't work, or they knew something about prayer that most of us don't. My history teacher once said, civilization progresses because we learn from our ancestors and don't start from scratch every time. So I learned from my ancestors, I learned from the saints, and I learned how prayer works. The most important book here was Prayer, the Great Means of Salvation and Perfection from St. Alphonsus Liguori. I'll summarize what I learned there at the very end of this video. But back to the experiment. After a few weeks of following the advice of the saints, I had an experience that I think many people have, and it's usually described as feeling God's love. That experience made me curious and further motivated me to continue with my experiment. The thing is that I'm not someone who can be convinced that a religion is true just because they had warm, fuzzy feelings once. I needed more. After a few months, I came across a sermon from Archbishop Fulton Sheen where he said that if knowledge isn't shared, it becomes pride. So I realized that I was running into a problem here because I had read a lot of books by that time, and I knew that I couldn't become a saint if I didn't share that knowledge somehow. Because pride, as I had learned from all those books, was the worst vice and had to be avoided if one wants to become a saint. This is the reason why I started this YouTube channel. It's my way of following the advice of the saints. So I continued reading the books and made videos about them, and eventually I reached the conclusion that Christianity does have some good arguments going for it, and as far as I could see, there were no contradiction in its teaching. But then I had a conversation with a Muslim acquaintance where he told me that the reason he's still a Muslim is because he didn't find any contradictions in Islam either. I realized that not seeing any contradictions wasn't a sufficient reason to believe that Christianity is true, because it isn't the only religion for which you can reach that conclusion. So I had to continue my experiment. Apart from reading theological literature, I was also watching this type of content online, and I was particularly interested in the videos of Alex O'Connor. His arguments against Christianity posed a major challenge for me because I was living radically as a Christian, but lacked the conviction that Christianity was actually true, and his videos added to that doubt. There was one video in particular that challenged the theory I was testing. It is titled "Why I Don't Believe in God," and in that video Alex O'Connor presents a case against God's existence that he made during a debate. I'd like to show you the beginning of that opening statement.
I want to make my own case that upon an honest analysis of the world we find ourselves in, it should compel us to dismiss the hypothesis of a supernatural creator. I will not be asking you to look in ancient scripture, nor to the beginning of the universe, nor indeed down a microscope, instead just to your direct experience of the world and facts about the lives of people within it. I will, however, indulge in a brief biblical recital, because I want to begin with a reading from the book of Psalms. So if you could all turn to Psalm 139, unless, of course, you've already committed this famous passage to memory. Verse 7 onwards reads, "Where can I go from your presence? Or where can I flee from your spirit? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of the Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall guide me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." This poem in its entirety is given by the NRSV a title, "The Inescapable God." It's a message of bold reassurance to the believer, reminding them that since God is present everywhere, pervading every inch of our universe, he is, in the happiest sense possible, inescapable. But my first argument, and it's going to be the first of three, against the viability of theism, flows from the demonstrable fact that this divine consolation is seemingly not offered universally, and often in fact restricted from those who want it the most. I'm going to be making the claim specifically that atheism or naturalism provides a better account for three facts of our universe. The first being the hiddenness of God, the second being the geographical, statistical arrangement, shall we say, of religious belief, and the third will be the problem of gratuitous suffering, and we'll see if we get time to finish it off.
In the video, he also explains how much he had already tried in order to find God. Among other things, he earned a theology degree from Oxford, but all his efforts were in vain. When I first watched that video a couple of years ago, I realized that trying to find God by studying theology would probably not work for me either. So I had to continue my experiment of testing the theory in practice. The problem was that regardless of how often my prayers were answered, I'm the type of person who still sees room for doubt. During this time, my confidence that Christianity was the right religion fluctuated. But no matter how great my doubts were, I always chose to believe. I explain what it means to choose to believe in the video that you'll see on the screen. Finally, after years of struggle, I understood the concept of intellectual pride and asked God to free me from it, although I used different words in that prayer. That day, God's existence became obvious to me, and my thoughts about theology became much clearer, and I began to understand many things that had previously seemed inaccessible to me. I reached the conclusion that Christianity works, and I would like to demonstrate what I mean by that now. So by saying that Christianity works, I mean that the promises made in the Bible can be verified. One such promise is made in the psalm Alex O'Connor cited in his case against God's existence, Psalm 139, 7-10. It says that we can't flee from God's presence wherever we look. If that is indeed the case, we should be able to find God everywhere, even in that video from Alex O'Connor. If we can do that, this will be one example of a promise in the Bible that can be verified by us today. So I'd like to make my case for God's existence using his arguments against God's existence, using only his arguments against God's existence. I assume that this is not the first video about arguments for or against God's existence that you've ever watched, and you're probably already familiar with many such arguments. So I won't bore you with things like the impossibility of infinite regresses in support of the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. Instead, I will make my own case why an honest analysis of the world we find ourselves in should compel us to accept the hypothesis of God's existence. To make my case for God's existence, I'll use exactly the observations Alex used to argue against God's existence. I just allowed myself to switch up their order. I will start with the geographical spread of religious beliefs, then I'll move on to divine hiddenness, and finally I will get to the existence of suffering in the world. Let's start with the geographical spread of beliefs. If there is a loving God who wants everyone to be saved, then finding him should be equally accessible to people regardless of the culture they come from and the religion they were raised in. The problem now is that belief in God isn't spread evenly across the world, because if someone comes from Europe, they are much more likely to be Christian than someone who comes from the Middle East. But what if we're overlooking something here? I'd like to draw your attention to a specific definition of God that can only be found in Christianity. God is love. And now let's think about the geographical spread of belief in love. To love and to be loved are universal desires across the whole planet. Regardless where on earth you turn on the radio, chances are very high that you will be listening to a love song. I mean, we don't have to speak those languages to know that regardless of whether you're in Korea, Egypt, or Brazil, people probably don't sing about their college graduation or their next job promotion. Now, there are also some people who don't believe in love, and the existence of selfless love isn't obvious in a world that is ruled by the survival of the fittest. But everyone at least hopes that love exists, and some even wish that they could kill that hope, because then it wouldn't hurt so much. Love is the central message of the Bible, and it's also universally captivating on this planet. It occupies the minds and hearts of people across all cultures, centuries, and ages. After all, a loving God would have to be accessible to a child just as well as to a scientist, right? Babies can say I love you to their parents very early on, and even the most atheistic scientists claim that they love science. Under my recent video, someone commented that babies don't really understand the concept of love yet. That's true, but who does? We all have some idea of what love is, but no one really understands it fully. And as St. Augustine said, if you can't understand it, it isn't God. That also means that what we experience on earth isn't God, because God is the perfection of love, and human love is always imperfect. But regardless of how imperfect the love is that we experience in this life, we all share a desire for true, unconditional, and unlimited love. The love that is God. We all can choose to live according to that desire, and as St. John of the Cross said, at the end of our life, we will be judged on our love. Now let's get to the second part of this case for God's existence. Divine hiddenness. Usually, the objection goes like this. If a perfectly loving God existed, then he would want everyone to know him, and his existence would be obvious. God's existence isn't obvious, and therefore a perfectly loving God doesn't exist. There are many ways to answer this objection, but today I'd like to show that divine hiddenness is actually expected if Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, then we would expect the Bible to describe and explain our world accurately, and we would expect our world to be designed in the most loving way possible. I'd like to show now that divine hiddenness meets both of these conditions. So the first condition is that our world is accurately described and explained in the Bible. And regarding divine hiddenness, the Bible says the following in the Gospel of Matthew. I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. I explained this in more detail in my previous video, but for those who haven't watched that one yet, I'll summarize it now. God hides from the wise and learned, and this isn't because knowledge or intelligence itself are a hindrance to finding God, but because they are often correlated with pride. Pride, on the other hand, is the opposite of humility, which can be defined as the virtue of the recognition of truth. This definition works because humility means seeing oneself as one truly is, and by implication, also seeing everything else as it truly is. For example, in order to recognize God's greatness, it's necessary to recognize one's own insignificance. One possible way of seeking truth is actually just the pursuit of humility. But let me explain now why pride correlates with intelligence and what exactly pride of the intellect is. I'd like to illustrate this by describing the typical life experience of a smart person. In childhood, for example, a smart child is in school and realizes that other students understand things more slowly and usually also have a limit of what they're capable of understanding, or at least willing to try to understand. For example, mathematical concepts that seem like hocus pocus to other students are completely clear for the smart student. In extreme cases, the child might even learn that it's more likely that the teacher is wrong or that there's a mistake in the textbook than that they themselves made a mistake. This isn't necessarily arrogance because it can actually correspond to reality. So with that experience, the child now grows into an adult and realizes that religions make weird claims that no one really understands. And because of their life experience in all other areas of life, they are tempted to conclude that the most likely explanation for this phenomenon is that religion is nonsense, and other people simply haven't realized that. Very smart people aren't used to encountering concepts that they can't understand. So they conclude that if they can't understand something, this something is nonsense and should be discarded. That's pride of the intellect. And just to clarify, because people have been asking under my recent video, Christians can also be intellectually proud. So the issue isn't thinking that one has superior intellectual capabilities compared to most other people. The issue is thinking that if one's own intellect can't understand it, that's because something objectively doesn't make sense. Pride of the intellect also means thinking that the thoughts of more simple-minded people are worthless. If we assume that God exists, then the reality of the situation is that compared to an omniscient God, the difference between a child and a genius is negligible. And one possible consequence of pride of the intellect is overlooking just that. Now, how is it fair that God excludes the proud from heaven? To understand this, we have to look at another definition of humility. Humility also means opening our hands to receive God's love, while pride means telling God that we don't need Him and don't want His help. Since God doesn't force anyone, He respects the wishes of the proud and does not impose His love on them. Because without consent, there is no love. Now let's get to the final part of this case for God's existence, the existence of suffering in the world. Whenever someone makes a case against God's existence, the strongest argument is often the problem of suffering. But even suffering can support God's existence. The existence of the Christian God specifically. Let's remind ourselves that according to Christianity, God is love. Now, what would we expect our world to look like if it was made by love? Would we expect there to be suffering? Well, think about it. I'm pretty sure that you've observed in your life that somehow love is connected to pain. As C.S. Lewis said, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. So because of this, in a world created by love, we would expect there to be suffering. But we can ask further, why does love cause us pain if it is good? The answer is that love isn't what hurts us. Imperfect love is. Even though we humans all have an idea of what love is, We're all still learning what it means to love. So what hurts us is that by loving, we make ourselves vulnerable to people who don't fully know how to treat us right. And even if they knew, they sometimes choose to treat us differently because they value something else more than love. And we ourselves are also not capable of perfect love, which adds to the pain. We worry that someone else is loved more than us and become jealous. Or we might love someone, but if they don't love us back, our love can quickly turn into hate. If we had loved them perfectly, our love wouldn't have turned into hate. But the question now is, why did a perfect God create an imperfect world? Why didn't he just create us with the ability to love perfectly? The thing is that love can't be forced, it must be free. So it requires the possibility of choosing it or rejecting it. And this possibility entails pain, because then we can choose violence, exploitation, or betrayal. That's why a world of love must contain some suffering. The point that I'm trying to make is that if Christianity is true, then suffering is expected in this world. C.S. Lewis said that the only two places that are free from the dangers of love are heaven and hell. Both are places that are consciously chosen here on earth. No one goes to hell by accident, and no one is forced to go to heaven. In hell, the suffering consists in the chosen absence of love. And in heaven, there is no suffering because according to Christian doctrine, in order to go to heaven, we have to choose love. Now, one fascinating aspect of love on earth is that we still desire it despite how painful it is. At some point, we prefer being vulnerable over being lonely, and we prefer being loved imperfectly over not being loved at all. And that's the central message of the Bible, that love is worth the sacrifice, that trust is worth the risk of betrayal, that freedom is worth the danger of getting lost. Or in other words, that behind every cross, there is a resurrection. According to Psalm 139, God's presence is inescapable, and so far I've shown that he can be found in all three arguments Alex O'Connor used against God's existence: the geographical spread of religious belief, divine hiddenness, and suffering. All three can be turned into a case for the existence of the Christian God. But there's one thing left to show. What about the suffering we don't understand yet? Where is God in the suffering that seems devoid of any loving plan? The suffering that seems gratuitous? The answer to this is one word: Jesus. By becoming man and being crucified, Jesus entered all forms of suffering on earth: violence, humiliation, abandonment, betrayal, mortality, and ultimately death. And just like we don't know why this specific amount or type of suffering in the world is necessary, we can also ask why the specific amount of Christ's suffering was necessary. Why not one whiplash less? Because of Christ's own salvific suffering, Christian theology holds that Jesus is present in every human suffering, and that the effects of this redemptive work extend to the whole of creation. The belief that Christ is present in every suffering has even made it into the English language, since one synonym for suffering is cross. So one could say that wherever you look on this earth, you see crosses. Jesus made himself part of the very condition that is invoked as evidence against his goodness or existence, the reality of innocent suffering. Whenever someone makes a case for God's existence, the strongest objection is usually some version of the problem of suffering. So one could say that all arguments for God's existence have a gap, and that gap has the shape of a cross. I don't know the reason for every suffering on this planet, and I'm not sure if human beings are capable of grasping that in general in this life. After all, if there is an all-knowing God, we would expect there to be things about him that we don't understand. However, what I learned over the past 5 years is that when I do what God asks of me, good things happen. Admittedly, having faith in Jesus is like jumping in at the deep end. But after a while, you realize that it's the deep end of an ocean of love. So I'm Catholic for the same reason why I use math, because it works phenomenally well. And for me, rejecting Christianity because one doesn't know the answer to a theological question is like rejecting maths because of unsolved mathematical problems. Math describes the world, and Catholicism explains it. Both have challenging areas humanity doesn't know the answer to yet. But not knowing an answer should be a reason to search for it, and not a reason to only start adopting a worldview after all questions have been answered. As my high school math teacher used to say, math is not a spectator sport. If you just watch ChatGPT solve math problems for you, you'll think you understand them. But as soon as you have to solve a problem yourself in the exam, you'll probably struggle a lot. Not that I've ever tried. That would be obviously stupid, and why would I do that? Jokes aside, if you want to understand math and become good at it, you have to become a mathematician in practice. And it's not enough to watch someone else solve the problems for you. And the same is true for theology. In order to understand theology, one has to become a saint. It's a common mistake to believe that just studying theology or reading books will lead one to find God or to make deep theological discoveries. In order to better understand the connection between suffering and love, we have to pick up our cross and follow Christ. As Jesus said in John 5:39-40, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness to me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life." And there is actually only one Bible passage that explains how the truth can be known. "If you obey my teaching, you are really my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." It makes sense why this is the only way to actually know the truth and to verify whether Christianity is true. We can't go back in time to see if the resurrection really happened, but we can see whether Jesus said the truth, because what he promised 2 millennia ago must still be true today. As Jesus said, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And this brings us to the last part of this video, where I explain how you can actually try this at home. The main thing to know here is how to pray. So let's look at what St. Alphonsus teaches about prayer. He writes that for prayer to work, 4 conditions must be met: humility, faith, perseverance, and the object of the prayer must be something in accordance with God's will. To make sure that we meet the first condition, we can preface our prayers by asking for the grace to pray this prayer with humility. Regarding faith, it's not necessary to be convinced of the fact that prayer will work, because we can't decide to be convinced of something. It's sufficient to make an act of faith, which can be a choice, as I explain in more detail in this video. The third condition, perseverance, just means praying until the prayer is granted, which can be more than once. And finally, the object of our prayer must be something in accordance with God's will, or as St. Alphonsus says, it must be something necessary for salvation. That might sound underwhelming, but believe me, it's not. Try it yourself if you haven't yet. We can also pray for other things, but there is no guarantee that those requests will be granted, because God is love, and He will only grant the wishes that are good for us. Often we don't know what that is, but the one thing that we can know that's always good for us is salvation. Start praying like that and observe what happens. This could be your little experiment.